Welcome to my PowerPoint presentation on the causes of the Spanish Civil War. As you can see from the Menti we did earlier on today, that lots and lots of people have a really positive view of Spain. They've been there on holidays, they've enjoyed the weather, the cuisine, the culture, which is a very positive thing. But we did the Menti so I could contrast Spain today with the Spain of less than 80 years ago. People have a very positive perception of Spain, but 80 years ago it was a very different country and was about to become embroiled in one of the ugliest and most brutal civil war conflicts in the history of Europe. It pitted brother against brother, rich against poor, religion against atheists, region against region. It saw the indiscriminate bombing and murder of civilians in a way that no war had ever seen before. It was the very first time that carpet bombing had been used as a means to intimidate the local population who were in no way involved with the armed forces. An estimated 400,000 people were killed and hundreds of thousands more fled Spain, going to France, going to Germany, but even further afield to Mexico, where they were welcomed with open arms. The war itself took on an international dimension as thousands of individuals flocked to Spain to join the cause, to fight for what was really regarded as the last great cause in Europe. The war itself raged for 3 years, from 1936 to 1939, which brought us right up to the Second World War. And really it should have served as a warning to the Allies about what was happening in Europe, but many chose to ignore it in the course of diplomacy. I have to point out that the causes of the Civil War did not begin a year or two before 1936. The causes go back decades, if not centuries before this, and we are going to explore these in the presentation. Thank you. As I mentioned earlier on, the cause of the Spanish Civil War did not evolve over a few years or even over a few decades, but rather had its roots in Spain's long imperial history. And as you can see from this picture here, we've noted that the loss of empire and status had a major impact on Spain itself. This really began in the years between 1810 and 1825, when a lot of the Spanish-speaking countries in South America that we know today, Chile, Argentina, Colombia, gained independence from Spain. And it evolved into something much worse than that when Spain got involved with America in 1898 in what's called the Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War saw the Spanish army defeated by the American army, and they were forced to cede huge swathes of what was left of their holdings in the Caribbean. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, all of these were ceded to the United States, and this had a huge impact on Spain, both socially, economically, and culturally, because don't forget, Spain was very proud of its imperial past and all it had done to these countries over the years. As you can see in this slide here, how huge the Spanish Empire is. It isn't just involved in Europe or North Africa, as you can see there. It also has huge swathes of the country in South America as well as North America. We tend to forget about that. It has no influence in Canada, which was the preserve of the British and the French. And you can see also the highlighted islands in red include islands in the Caribbean and as far afield as the Philippines. So it was a huge imperial power. And don't forget, all of that money that was been made there was all pouring back into the Spanish coffers, making Spain a very powerful country indeed. And in this slide here, you can clearly see highlighted the countries that were still a part of the Spanish Empire before 1898. It is important to remember that it's 1898 because this is when the Spanish-American War happened and when Spain ultimately lost the last of its holdings in the Caribbean and in the Philippines. This shows us Spain's imperial holdings in the 1800s, and they've been reduced to just Caribbean islands as well as the Canary Islands, Spanish Sahara and Morocco. And it's very important that we note Morocco remains part of the Spanish colonial empire, because this in fact is where the Spanish coup of 1936 begins and then moves on to Spain itself and precipitates the start of the Spanish Civil War. And here we can see a cartoon which celebrates the liberation of Cuba from the Spanish Empire. The Spanish-American War of 1898 reduced Spanish holdings even more as the victorious Americans took control of the islands of Cuba, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and the Philippines and Guam further afield in the Pacific. This really was the final nail in the coffin for the Spanish Empire, which was left with just holdings in Morocco and in the Spanish Sahara. Another one of the long-term causes of the Spanish Civil War was the role of the Catholic Church within Spanish society. As you can see from the slide here, I've highlighted the main points and I'm going to go through them right now. Firstly, Spain had long regarded itself as the most Catholic of Catholic countries, and it believed that to be Spanish, you had to be Catholic. Don't forget that this is the country that introduced us to the Spanish Inquisition, which was designed to force non-Catholics to either convert or to forfeit their land. Many people believe that in actual fact it was just a big land grab by the Catholic Church, and if that's the case, it was very effective because the Catholic Church in Spain was one of the biggest landowners. The Catholic Church had amassed great wealth and power over the century, and it used this power to influence political favour. Like many other Catholic countries, the Church controlled education and was able to propagate its views from the pulpit. The Church itself was closely aligned to the Spanish aristocracy, who made up most of the senior clergy, and this meant that the clergy tended to support the rights of the upper class and the landowning class, which would prove problematic because it caused great resentment among the poor and the landless. We should of course not be surprised to learn that the Church was ultra-conservative and opposed to all forms of liberalism, which showed itself in the Church's opposition to all things that might reduce its power, like unions, socialist groups, and feminism. We're going to look at another of the long-term causes of the civil conflict, and that is the role of the Spanish army in Spanish society. Firstly, it held a very, very special role in Spanish society due to its imperial past. People had a very fond regard for the Spanish army. It was seen as the protector of the nation and the protector of Catholicism. However, its loss to America in 1898 highlighted some major flaws within the Spanish army. And one of the most obvious of these flaws was how top-heavy it was with officers. For many aristocratic families, sending a second or a third son to join the Spanish army was par for the course. They also expected that this son would rise quite quickly through the ranks and become an officer in the Spanish army. It was very conservative because it was aligned quite closely with the aristocracy, and it was really in dire need of reform, and the ordinary, everyday people of Spain resented the Spanish army because it could be quite brutal when it came to putting down insurrections or kind of union unrest. And also the ordinary people paid for it. They paid high taxes to maintain an army that they actually felt was not representative of the actual people that it was supposed to represent. It was also regarded as quite inefficient, maybe because it was regarded as unprofessional due to the large numbers of officers within the ranks. It had major problems, not just in its conflicts in the Americas, but also in Morocco between 1906 and 1927. Another problem facing Spain at the time was the rise of separatism within its borders. In fact, it still has that problem today. Both the Basque regions and the Catalan regions wanted more decentralization, if not full independence, and not less. They had separate languages, separate cultures, separate traditions, separate churches, and while they were ostensibly in Spain, they really felt they should have more autonomy within the actual region. Now, they had limited autonomy up until the time Primo de Rivera came back into power, and he rescinded these limited gains. Now, this pleased conservatives and centralists who believed that more separatism could ultimately lead to the breakup of Spain, but it really angered and enraged those who were looking for more independence. And here is a picture of Catalan separatists in 1920 Spain on the streets marching for more independence and more autonomy. Now, in actual fact, what happened was that they received less right to self-determination under the dictatorship of Primo de Rivera. He rescinded their limited autonomy, and in actual fact he enforced laws which banned the singing of the Catalan national anthem and the display of the Catalan national flag. Prior to the Civil War, Spain was primarily an agricultural country. There were pockets of industrialized areas, Barcelona, Pass of the Basque region and other parts of northern Spain, which was probably another reason to deny these areas independence, but most of the population worked on the land. This is perhaps the most contentious issue that faced many Spaniards prior to the Civil War. Roughly 60% of Spain was owned by 15% of the population. The church, as well as individual aristocrats, owned huge estates in Spain, and the plights of these agricultural workers were a key factor in the Civil War. In the centre and south of Spain, large estates were called latifundia, and these were owned by absentee landlords who cared little for the land or indeed their tenants. While in the north, the holdings of peasant farmers were too small to be economically viable, and many workers had to migrate seasonally for work or face starvation. Many lived in abject poverty, and as a result, rioting and disorder often broke out, only to be brutally suppressed by the army and the civil guard. Some of these farmers supported anarchist groups and socialist groups, while others aligned themselves to the Catholic Agrarian Foundation. Even in the poor agricultural areas, there was no consensus as to what was best for Spain. Here we're going to talk about the lack of political stability, which was another long-term cause of the Spanish Civil War. Spain had swung like a pendulum from right to left to right again for decades. As you can see here, we mentioned that there were 19 military coups between 1803 and 1936, as well as 3 civil wars between 1833 and 1876. Every time a new political party came to power, they rescinded the work of the previous government. Miguel Primo de Rivera came to power as a dictator in 1923 with the support of King Alfonso XIII, and his motto was country, religion, monarchy. He, however, was ousted by the left in 1931, and this was the start of the Second Republic, which itself was replaced at a later stage by a right-wing government in 1933. And here we can see a photo of King Alfonso XIII of Spain, who exiled himself in 1931. King Alfonso had originally supported the dictator Miguel Primo de Rivera in 1923 in his quest for power, and this support made the monarchy extremely unpopular with the people and prompted the growth of a republican movement. As economic hardship engulfed Spain due to the Great Depression, the king withdrew his support of Rivera, and Rivera had to agree to democratic elections. In these democratic elections, the electorate voted overwhelmingly for a republic, and King Alfonso XIII chose to exile himself to avoid widespread violence. He never renounced his crown, however, he never returned to Spain either. The Great Depression was a global economic crisis which severely impacted Spain. Spain was an agricultural economy that depended on exports to increase revenue. These exports included wine, olive oil, fruit. With the economic depression, Primo de Rivera decided to turn his attention to an extensive building program to improve Spain's infrastructure. This has included road building, railways, and electrification. The problem with this was, due to the global economic crisis, it caused Spain to accumulate massive debts, and it alienated many landowners and many of the aristocracy, and it ultimately led to de Rivera's downfall and to the return of democratic elections in 1931. The elections in 1931 that followed King Alfonso's departure brought to power the Second Republic. The Second Republic were a centre-left party who promised to modernise Spain. However, the tensions that existed in Spain before continued. Antaña promised to reform Spain. He promised to introduce church reform, reform of the army and land ownership, but this would bring him into contact with right-wing conservative Spain. The Second Republic came into power based on their promise for reform. They promised to separate church and state, they promised to introduce land reforms, they promised to reform the army, and they promised to guarantee more human rights and basic freedoms for the people of Spain. They failed on two fronts. Many people felt that they had bitten off more than they could chew, and that the pace of reform was very, very slow. And also, anybody who chose to show dissent were crushed without mercy. This is the flag of the very short-lived Second Spanish Republic, which lasts from 1931 to 1933. During that period, they did try to introduce a number of reforms. They did try to modernize Spain, but ultimately all of these were stymied when they fell from power in 1933 and a right-wing government was re-elected in its stead. The first thing Anthania needed to do was to deal with the Catholic Church. He had made many anti-clerical speeches and statements, so he really tried to separate church and state. And the first thing he did was to remove the Catholic Church from its role in education. Then he decided to take further control by preventing the government from paying priests' salaries, believing instead that the church itself should pay for its own employees, so to speak. The Jesuits were banned from Spain. However, to counteract this, an organization called CIDA was founded. This was a right-wing group which was opposed to the Second Republic and to all the reforms that the Second Republic had introduced into Spain, particularly where it concerned the Catholic Church. The army played a very special role in Spanish society. People regarded it with great affection. They regarded it as the protector of the nation. They believed it was the role of the army to intervene in politics if necessary. And as I said before, there have been at least 3 coups prior to the main Spanish coup of 1939. They also believed that Spain had been served well by its soldiers in its empire. It had a few flaws. It had performed very badly in the Spanish-American War of 1898, and it also underperformed when there were issues in Morocco. So, in order to make the army more professional and more elite, Anthania decided it was time to reform. With this in mind, he offered those in the army retirement with full pay, and 50% of those officers who were offered this took it. Those that remained, however, were quite right-wing, nationalistic and conservative. Most of them had served as officers in Morocco and regarded themselves as Africanistas, and they were very wary of what the government was trying to do in the army. The army itself, however, was quite unpopular with the general public. They found it to be brutal whenever there was any incidents of union activity or uprising. The army was sent in and they reacted with extreme force and very expensive. People had to pay very high taxes to maintain the army, which nobody liked. The army, however, really resented the fact that the government was taking such a close interest in them, especially when the government closed the military academy in Zaragoza. This really radicalized those that were left in the army to be on the offensive against the new government, which they regarded as anti-Spanish, anti-Catholic and anti-army. Spain had been hit quite badly by the Great Depression. They found their exports had dropped, and a lot of the rich landowners had allowed their land to fall into a state of disrepair. It was because of this that in 1932 Anthania introduced the Agrarian Reform Bill. Now, this was a land distribution program. It would allow the state to take over estates and distribute them to peasants. Now, they could only do this if they requested the landlords to start recultivating their land, and if they didn't, then the requisition would take place. In theory, compensation was to be paid to landowners. However, due to the lack of money available in Spain at the time, this very rarely happened, and as a result, many on the right saw this as a move towards communism. Additional things were introduced by Anthania. Tenants were protected from eviction, and the working day was reduced to 8 hours. Many workers joined both agrarian labour unions and industrial labour unions to try and protect themselves. Catalan and Basque separatism had long been a part of Spanish politics. Their unique languages and customs were a thorn in the side of Spanish homogeny. However, the Catalan separatism debate had been invigorated by Primo de Rivera's reveal of the limited amount of self-government that they had before he came to power. When the Second Republic came into power in 1931, Azaña gave Catalonia a degree of autonomy. It got its own parliament, it could make its own laws and decrees, it controlled its own education, meaning that the Catalan language could now be taught again in Catalan schools, and this really angered the right, who feared it threatened the very existence of Spain. Azaña's time in power was to be short-lived, however. His government was ousted in 1933 and was replaced by the Right Republic. Azaña had survived a coup in 1932 by General José Sanjuro, but he couldn't survive the general elections of 33 because he'd failed to deliver on some of his promises, like comprehensive land reforms. Those on the left believed that he'd betrayed their cause because he'd fallen far short of what he promised, and those on the right believe all of these reforms were a concerted attack on all things that were good and holy in Spain, including the church, the army, and landowners. Therefore, in 1933, a new right-wing government was elected. This was a coalition of the right, which included members of the Falange, a far-right fascist group based on the Nazi Party, the Carlists, who were conservative monarchists and wanted to bring back the monarchy, and the largest group, CIDA, a right-wing political party which was led by José María Gil Robles, that had been established to defend the church and the army and landowners. As soon as they were in power, the Right Republic began to dismantle the reforms of the previous government. The Catholic Church regained control of education, payments to priests were reintroduced, and the land reforms of the previous government were halted. Catalonia had its autonomy suspended after a protest by miners in Asturias, which was violently quashed by Spanish troops. These were the brutal Africanistas based in Morocco who had survived Azaña's coup and were radicalized on the right in the protest. Their leader was none other than General Franco. These 2 years in government are known in Spain as the Black Years. Spain seemed to be heading for the abyss, and to prevent further chaos, a general election was called. Support for the right collapsed in these elections in 1936 and paved the way for the Popular Front to return to power, led once again by Azaña. While supported by various left-wing organisations, Azaña was not a radical, even though the right believed that the Popular Front was a Stalinist organisation. There was less and less common ground between the left and the right. This period also saw unprecedented civil unrest. There were numerous civil and general strikes, churches and newspapers were burnt in arsonist attacks, and there was a general slide towards anarchy, and Azaña couldn't seem to do anything about it. What he could prevent was an attempted coup which he discovered might be brewing, and he exiled troublesome generals like Franco and Mola to the Canaries and to Morocco. As I've already said, Africanista officers had been planning a coup since the Popular Front returned to power in 1936. Azaña was well aware of this and moved these key figures to remote postings. He sent Mola to Morocco and Franco to the Canaries. However, sending his generals into exile failed to diminish the appetite among the right for a coup. In fact, despite being in exile, Franco, Mola and Sanjuro continued their plans to overthrow the government. And these plans were brought forward by the political assassination of former finance minister and leading fascist José Calvo Sotelo on July the 13th. His death was to avenge the murder of José Castillo, a member of the Assault Guard and leading socialist, by a Falangist gang in Madrid. This was just the opportunity the right needed. General Mola and General Sanjuro planned the coup in Morocco with the assistance of the Spanish Foreign Legion, who were also known as the Bridegrooms of Death. These were the most brutal and conservative force in the army, and they had survived the cull of the army by Azaña in 1933. They'd also proved themselves in the Moroccan conflict of 1932 using brute force and chemical weapons. They saw themselves as the saviour of Spain and Catholicism. Franco left the Canaries and joined the generals in Morocco, and as he commanded the Moroccan forces before, he was seen as the man to oversee operations. He overthrew the civilian government and took control of Spanish Morocco. His next target was to infiltrate mainland Spain, to establish a military government there, and to do away with all oppositions to the right rule. The left wing would have to fight for survival. The details of the coup, which were an open secret among the right, were soon discovered, and this prompted the generals involved in the coup to act immediately. They hadn't intended to act quite so quickly, but as of the 17th of July, they needed to act. Spanish Morocco had already been secured by the Foreign Legion, so Franco flew to mainland Spain to ignite the coup there. He was flown here by the German Condor Legion, and this would not be the last time that he enlisted their help in this endeavour. The rebels, however, failed to take any major city except for Seville, which was used as a landing point for Franco's troops. The coup had failed, but the civil war had started.